The wind howled like a caged animal outside the tiny farmhouse sitting alone at the edge of Dust Valley. Rain pounded against the rusted roof and slithered into every crack it could find. Inside, Widow Mara Dawson sat near the flickering fireplace, her needle trembling in her hand as she patched up an old quilt that had already seen too many winters. Grief had lived in this house longer than she had. Ever since her husband, a cattleman known across the frontier, was buried beneath the oak hill, silence had been her only companion. The townsfolk kept their distance, respecting her loneliness or maybe avoiding it. But she endured each day, warming herself with the memory of kindness she once shared and still refused to let die. Just as she set her sewing aside, a desperate knocking shook the door so violently it startled her to her feet. Mara hesitated a moment. Visitors rarely came during storms, and never at night. With cautious steps, she cracked the door open and found a soaked, shivering boy standing there, clutching the fragile hand of a frail old woman. The boy's hair was plastered to his forehead, fear gleaming in his wide brown eyes. The old woman's silver hair hung heavy with rain, her breath shallow as she leaned on the boy for support. "Please," the boy stammered, voice trembling, "the bridge washed out, and Grandma, she can't walk any farther." Mara's heart clenched at the sight. She didn't know their names, their pasts, or their intentions, but she knew what helplessness looked like. Without another thought, she swung the door wide open. "Come in out of that rain. You're safe now." Warmth prickled the boy's cheeks as he guided his grandmother inside. Mara helped the old woman settle near the fire, rubbing her cold hands gently. "You're kind," the grandmother whispered. "We didn't know where else to go." Mara smiled faintly, something she hadn't done in a long while. "A storm doesn't care who we are," she said. "It tests whether we still remember how to care." The boy introduced himself as Evan, and his grandmother as Abigail. Mara noticed the fine stitching on their soaked clothing, elegant fabric she had only ever seen worn by the wealthy elite who lived far across the territory. What were they doing wandering the outskirts like common travelers? But she didn't pry. She fed them soup, warmed blankets around their shoulders, and offered them her own bed. "I'll sleep by the fire," she insisted. "Guests deserve comfort." As the rain continued its assault on the roof, Evan gazed around the humble home. The worn furniture, the cracks patched with love, the photographs of a smiling cowboy holding Mara's waist tight. He could sense the loneliness in the walls. "You live here all alone?" he asked softly. "Yes," Mara replied, her voice carrying both strength and sorrow. "But tonight, I don't feel alone." What none of them knew was that Evan and Abigail were no ordinary travelers. The two belonged to the Richmond dynasty, the wealthiest family across the entire Western Territory, owners of mines, railroads, and half the cattle driven through the region. Their disappearance that evening had already thrown businessmen and lawmakers into a frenzy. But here, in the warmth of Mara's home, riches had no meaning. Kindness did. Abigail watched Mara carefully, the way she tended to strangers without hesitation. "You remind me of someone," the grandmother murmured under her breath, narrowing her eyes in soft recognition. But she said nothing more. As the storm raged on, Evan drifted to sleep with a comfort he hadn't felt even in mansions of polished marble. Mara sat awake, staring into the fire, unaware that her simple act of compassion would soon change her life in ways she could never imagine. Before she finally rested her eyes, she whispered quietly to herself, a habit she'd kept since her husband's passing. "If anyone out there is listening, thank you for bringing company tonight." Morning sunlight washed over the valley, turning the storm's wreckage into glittering dew on every surface. Mara brewed coffee, the smell filling the small kitchen. Evan woke first, stretching as though he hadn't slept so well in years. Abigail followed, leaning on her cane but looking healthier already. Mara smiled at the sight. She rarely had someone to cook for, and the simple joy of preparing warm food revived a part of her she thought had died with her husband. "You've done too much for us," Abigail said gently while accepting the cup. Her eyes lingered on Mara with a mix of gratitude and curiosity, like she was studying a puzzle whose answer mattered greatly. Mara waved off the concern. "It's nothing. If my Henry were here, he'd say a stranger in need is a neighbor in disguise." The boy's gaze wandered again across the living room. Photos told a life story. Mara and Henry in front of a newly built barn, a younger Mara riding a horse with wild confidence, local fairs where Henry's name was proudly stitched on ribbons. Evan traced the frames with his eyes, whispering, "You must really miss him." Mara paused, the way grief always demands silence first. Then she nodded. Every sunrise,